Bore da pawb. Good morning, everyone. So this is your do now activity for this lesson. There are 4 questions. It's talking about competition, what a species is, and what adaptations are. You've done all of these things in your previous lessons. So pause the video now, answer these questions in your class notebook assignment, and then come back and we'll go through the answers. Okay, so question 1. What are the 3 things animals compete for? So the answer is food, mates, and territory. And remember, territory is the space that animals live in. Okay? Number 2, what are the 4 things plants compete for? So the answer is light, water, space, and minerals. Okay? Number 3, what is a species? So a species is a group of similar organisms that have certain features in common. And then finally, number 4, what are the 3 types of adaptation that are common amongst organisms? The answer for that is camouflage, climate, and catching prey / avoiding predator. Okay, so those are the answers to the do now activity. Give yourself a mark out of 4 if you got them right, and now we'll move on to today's lesson. So today is Dydd Mawrth, 2 Chwefror, and the lesson today is about natural selection. The learning objective for today is to understand the theory of evolution and that it's driven by natural selection. And the keywords for today are evolution, Darwin, variation, survival of the fittest, extinction, and natural selection. So the theory of evolution is that all organisms have arisen from simpler life forms over billions of years. It is driven by the mechanism of natural selection. For natural selection to occur, there must be genetic variation between individuals of the same species. This is caused by a mutation or new combinations of genes resulting from sexual reproduction. Most mutations have no effect on the appearance of an organism. Where they do, and if the environment is also changing, this can lead to a relatively rapid change. So some good words we can add onto here is the new combination of genes would be a new genotype, and a new appearance would be a new phenotype. Okay, so those are some good scientific words that we can use here. And now, based off those few slides, I want you to do these 4 questions. All the information for the answers for these questions are on the last 2 slides. So number 1, what is the theory for evolution? Number 2, what is evolution driven by? Number 3, what is genetic variation caused by? And number 4, when do mutations cause rapid change? So I want you to pause the video here, go answer those 4 questions in your class notebook assignment, and then come back to the video and we'll go through the answers. Okay, so let's go through the answers. Number 1, what is the theory of evolution? It's all organisms have arisen from simpler life forms over billions of years. Okay, so all organisms have arisen from simpler life forms over billions of years. Number 2, what is evolution driven by? Natural selection. What is genetic variation caused by? Changes in genes. And number 4, when do mutations cause rapid change? If the environment is also changing. Okay, so the word also here is really important because for it to cause rapid change, the genes have to change in the form of a mutation and the environment has to change as well. So it's the combination of the both that causes the rapid change. So give yourselves a mark out of 4 for that and we'll move on with the rest of the lesson. So now we're going to talk about variation. There's a few little vocab words we should go through first before we look at variation. So number 1 is the genotype, and that's the genes that an individual has. Then it's phenotype, which is the appearance that those genes cause. The next one, species, is a group of organisms with similar traits. And then variation is any difference between cells, individual organisms, or groups of organisms of any species caused by either genetic differences, which we would call genotypic variation, or by the effect of environmental factors on the expression of genetic potentials, which we would call phenotypic variation. So the two major factors that contribute to the appearance, which is the phenotype, and the function of an organism are genetic information, which would be passed from parents to offspring, or environment, which would be the conditions that affect the organism during its life, like climate or diet. These two factors account for a large amount of variation that we see within and between species, and usually both of the factors play a part. Some of these changes we see from variation are beneficial, others are not. The beneficial characteristics, which we would call the phenotype, means an organism is more likely to survive and pass on its genes to the next generation. Non-beneficial phenotypes may be detrimental to the organism and make it less likely to survive and pass on its genes to the next generation. The ability to be successful in doing this is called survival of the fittest. So if an organism is able to successfully survive and pass on its genes to the next generation, that is called the survival of the fittest. So now we're going to look at natural selection and the scientist that made that theory. So organisms with the new phenotype will outcompete the organisms without it, meaning they will win the best food, space, and mates. This will allow the successful organisms to survive and pass on the new phenotype to the next generation. Over time, this new phenotype will be passed through new generations, and the organism without the variation will die out, which is called becoming extinct. So Charles Darwin was the scientist that called this theory natural selection, and he said that this theory drives the theory for evolution. He defined natural selection as a process by which a species changes over time in response to environmental or genetic changes or competition between organisms in order for the species to survive. Okay, so that's what Charles Darwin said was the definition for the theory of natural selection, and this theory drives the theory for evolution. So this is a summary of how Charles Darwin used the theory of natural selection. His ideas were reduced to 5 things. They are variation, survival of the fittest, competition, inheritance, and extinction. So we'll talk through each of these now. So for variation, an organism will develop a variation with a new phenotype due to an environmental or genetic change. The new phenotype will be beneficial to the organism, which helps it to survive and pass on the genes to the next generation, and that's survival of the fittest. The organism with the new phenotype will compete with the old variant for food, space, resources, water, and mates. The beneficial phenotype helps it to win, so that's competition. The new phenotype will be able to mate with the best organisms and pass on the phenotype to the next generation. That's called inheritance. The old phenotype will lose out on food, space, water, resources, and space, so will die out, and that phenotype will become extinct, which means all members of the species will die. And that's extinction. So Darwin reduced his theory down to those 5 ideas, and now we're going to look at some examples of how that works with different organisms. Okay, so here's the first example. 2 green fish, by here, 1 fish, 2 fish, live in a green pond, and they have green offspring with the same genes as them. But a genetic mutation occurs, and they have 1 blue offspring, and that blue fish stands out against the green pond. And the next thing you know, a predator arrives, and the blue fish gets targeted because it stands out against the green pond. So that means the predator will kill the blue fish, and all of the surviving fish will be green. So this genetic mutation that makes that fish blue was a very negative variation, and it caused the blue fish to become extinct. But then the weather changes, and the algae that covers up the pond dies, and the pond clears up. So then the water becomes blue. The parent fish, which are these ones again, have more green offspring, and once again they have 1 blue offspring. The predator returns, but this time the green fish stand out from the blue pond, and the blue fish has an advantage. So this time the genetic mutation was beneficial, and that's because the environment changed. Okay, so the mutation plus the environmental change meant that the blue fish now has an advantage over the green fish. The blue fish grows up and has offspring with a green fish. So this is the original blue fish, and he has met a green fish, and they have had some offspring. Some of them are green and some of them are blue because their genes have mixed together and produced a mixture of green and blue offspring. The predator returns, and the water is still blue, so the green fish still stand out and get targeted by the predator, and only the blue fish survive. So all of the surviving fish are blue. Sometimes a genetic mutation will occur and a blue fish will have a green offspring. But as long as the water stays blue, the blue fish will have a competitive advantage and will survive. If the water turns green again, the green fish will start to thrive again and outcompete the blue fish, and then the majority of the fish will be green again. So that was just a simple way to look at it, how the environment has a big change on whether a mutation is beneficial or detrimental. So at the start, the mutation for the blue fish was very detrimental and the blue fish died out. But when the environment changed and the water became blue, the mutation for the blue fish became a very big advantage and allowed the blue fish to survive and pass on its genes. So the next example is about peppered moths. You need to know this example for your GCSE. Okay, so we've used the same format as before using Darwin's 5 ideas. So for variation, most peppered moths are pale and speckled. They are easily camouflaged amongst the lichens on the silver birch tree bark. There are some rare dark-coloured varieties that arose from a genetic mutation. These are easily seen and eaten by birds because they stand out against the silver birch tree bark. Competition. In areas with high levels of air pollution, the lichens die and the bark becomes discoloured by soot. The lighter peppered moths are now at a competitive disadvantage as they are now visible, and the dark-coloured moths now blend in with the tree bark. Survival of the fittest. The dark moths are now more likely to avoid detection by predators as they blend in with the bark. The genes for the dark colour are passed on to offspring and gradually become more and more common in the general population. That's for inheritance. And for extinction, if the environment remains polluted, the lighter peppered moths are more likely to become extinct. So here we've looked at a genetic mutation and then an environmental change, how that allowed the new phenotype to outcompete the old one. Survival of the fittest allowed us to survive and pass on our genes, which is inheritance, and the old phenotype became extinct. So the next example you have to know for your GCSE is about warfarin in rats. For variation, warfarin is the active ingredient in rat poison. Random mutations in the genomes of rats mean that some rats in a population have a natural resistance to warfarin. This causes a variation in the rat population because some rats are resistant to the rat poison and some rats are susceptible to the rat poison. So for competition, rats with the resistance will survive. That means they have more choice of mates, food and space than the rats without the resistance. Rats that have the resistance are at a selective advantage over the other rats, and they will survive to breed and pass on their genes with the resistance. The non-resistant rats will not be able to do that, so that's survival of the fittest. Inheritance, the genetic mutation that gives the resistance to warfarin is passed along to the next generation. And extinction, rats without the mutation are unable to survive because they are susceptible to the rat poison. There is less competition for the resistant rats and they will thrive. And the gene for warfarin resistance will eventually become common in the population over time, and the warfarin will no longer work as effectively for rat poison. Here's another good example that's happening recently. So it's methicillin resistant bacteria, but we can just say antibiotic resistant because it's other antibiotics too. So antibiotic resistant bacteria. So variation, bacteria mutate by chance, giving them a resistance to antibiotics. The non-resistant bacteria are more likely to be killed by the antibiotic, and they have a competitive disadvantage because the resistant bacteria will be able to survive and outcompete it. The antibiotic-resistant bacteria survive and reproduce more often. They will pass down their genes to a new generation, and the gene becomes more common in the general population. So that's for survival of the fittest and inheritance. And then the non-resistant bacteria are dying out because they are being outcompeted. So then they will slowly be replaced by the newer resistant strain, and the old strain will be extinct. Okay, so those are 3 important examples that you will need for your GCSE. I've used the same format for all of them, so you can get used to the idea that all of these examples have the 5 ideas. It's really important that you remember the 5 headings and use them all when you answer questions about natural selection. So to make sure you've understood that, here's a second review with 3 questions. Number 1, define natural selection. Number 2, what are the 5 ideas Darwin uses to explain natural selection and evolution. Number 3, state 2 examples of natural selection that has been seen in recent times. So I'd like you to fill in the answers to these in your class notebook assignment. Then there's some past paper questions for you guys to do. And then I would like you to hand your work in at the end of the lesson. Okay? So thanks, guys.